It was a quiet spring night in Toronto, the kind that feels heavy with stillness. In a small suburban home, 23-year-old Ken Parks lay slumped on his living room couch. The TV hummed softly in the background, but his eyes had long surrendered to exhaustion. Ken wasn't an ordinary young man anymore. Weeks of sleepless nights, mounting gambling debts, and a constant ache of guilt had pushed him to the edge. His body craved rest. His mind, kiss. Somewhere between wakefulness and dreams, something in him slipped. Without opening his eyes, Ken's body stirred. He stood up, walked across the room, and reached for his car keys. Barefoot, silent. His movements were steady, too steady for someone asleep. Moments later, the sound of an engine broke the night's calm. Unaware, Ken was driving, not across his dreams, but through the dark streets of Toronto, heading toward his in-laws' home 14 miles away. Inside his sleeping mind, there was no fear, no plan, no anger, only motion. Hours later, the city would wake to one of the most baffling and horrifying crimes in Canadian history. The streets were nearly empty when Ken Parks' blue car rolled through the intersection at Birchmount Road. Traffic lights flashed red, then green, but he didn't notice. Inside the vehicle, his face was calm, eyes half open, fixed somewhere far beyond the windshield. The engine hummed steadily as he covered 14 miles, a drive that would later baffle both police and doctors. At 4:10 a.m., the car slowed outside a quiet brick house, the home of Barbara and Dennis Woods, Ken's in-laws. The porch light was off. He stepped out, still barefoot, carrying nothing but his car keys. The front door was unlocked. He'd fixed it weeks before and remembered the loose latch, at least his body did. He moved through the hallway in silence. In the guest room, Barbara Woods, 42, stirred at the faint creak of floorboards. Before she could call out, Ken lunged. A blur of motion, a sudden, brutal struggle. Moments later, she collapsed, lifeless. Her husband, Dennis, awoke to the sound and rushed in, only to be grabbed, strangled, then left unconscious but alive. When it was over, Ken stood trembling in the dark, blood dripping from deep cuts in his own hands. Still asleep, still unaware. At 4:30 a.m., he left the house and drove away, heading not home, but toward the nearest police station. What happened next would turn this bloody mystery into a case the world had never seen before. The early morning silence at the Scarborough police station was broken by the sudden squeal of tires. A blue car pulled into the empty parking lot, its headlights cutting across the building's pale brick walls. Inside, two officers on night duty watched in confusion as a tall, disheveled man stepped through the doors. His hands soaked in blood, his shirt torn, streaked red to the elbows. But what froze them wasn't the sight, it was his face. Calm, pale, blank. He walked straight to the front desk, stared at the officer, and said softly, "I think I've killed some people." The officers rushed toward him. One grabbed his arm. He didn't resist. Instead, he looked down at his own hands as if noticing them for the first time. "My hands," he whispered. "They're cut. They hurt." He was placed under arrest, read his rights, and seated on a bench. Even then, he looked lost, as if he had just woken up in someone else's nightmare. When detectives arrived, they found no weapon on him, no sign of intoxication. Only those deep, jagged cuts across his palms, consistent with a violent struggle. Moments later, radio chatter confirmed a call from a nearby address. A woman found dead, another injured. The location matched the home of Ken's in-laws. And with that single call, a confession became a murder case and a mystery that would defy logic itself. As dawn crept over Scarborough, flashing red and blue lights washed over the quiet suburban street of Hilden Drive. Neighbors stood outside in robes and slippers, whispering as paramedics carried stretchers through the front door of the Woods residence. Inside, detectives found a scene of chaos and tragedy. Barbara Woods, 42, lay motionless near the front hallway, her body bearing the marks of a savage attack. Blood spattered the floorboards, smeared along the wall near the doorway. Her husband Dennis was found upstairs, barely conscious, his neck bruised from strangulation. Officers moved carefully, photographing every surface.
Dennis.
On the kitchen counter, they found a phone knocked from its cradle, a sign that Barbara may have tried to call for help. A trail of bloody footprints led toward the front porch, larger, male prints, consistent with bare feet. Outside, droplets marked a path to the driveway, then stopped where a car had been parked. By 6:45 a.m., investigators confirmed the vehicle's registration, Kenneth James Parks. Back at the station, Ken sat quietly in an interview room, wrapped in a gray blanket, staring down at his bandaged hands. He kept asking one question: is anyone hurt? He had no memory of what happened, no recollection of the drive, the attack, or even leaving his home. To detectives, it sounded impossible. But the evidence was undeniable. The only mystery now was why. Inside the gray walls of the interrogation room, Ken Parks sat motionless. Hours had passed since his arrival, yet he looked as if he'd just woken from a dream he couldn't piece together. Across the table, Detective Sergeant Michael Boyd switched on a tape recorder. "Ken," he said calmly, "we just need to know what happened tonight." Ken blinked. His voice trembled. "I don't know. I just remember going to sleep." Detectives leaned in. No trace of alcohol, no drugs, no visible signs of rage. His pulse was steady. His tone, confused but eerily sincere. When officers mentioned Barbara's death, his face crumbled. His head dropped into his hands. "No," he whispered, shaking uncontrollably. "Not Mom. I never hurt her." By mid-morning, a police doctor examined him. His palms had deep, crescent-shaped lacerations, consistent with gripping a sharp object during a struggle. Blood tests confirmed they were self-inflicted, likely from clutching a knife blade. No sedatives. No alcohol. No psychotic episodes. At 11:45 a.m., detectives paused the interview. Something about this case didn't fit the usual pattern. There was motive, opportunity, and evidence, but no intent. One investigator murmured to another, "What if he really doesn't remember?" It sounded absurd until the results of Ken's medical evaluation came back that afternoon and changed everything. By early afternoon, police escorted Ken Parks to Toronto General Hospital for a full medical evaluation. He looked hollow, pale, exhausted, yet strangely calm. Nurses cleaned his wounds while doctors took blood samples and recorded his vital signs. When asked to recount the night, he repeated the same words. "I went to sleep on the couch, then I woke up here." Dr. Roger Broughton, a neurologist specializing in sleep disorders, was called in after officers mentioned Ken's odd state. He observed Ken's manner, slow blinking, delayed speech, and spontaneous hand movements, all signs of someone disoriented between sleep and wakefulness. By 3 p.m., Ken underwent an EEG brain scan, followed later by an overnight sleep study. Electrodes were attached to his scalp, chest, and wrists to monitor brain activity. The data shocked doctors. It showed patterns consistent with parasomnia, a rare condition where parts of the brain stay asleep while the body acts out complex behaviors. There was no sign of intoxication, no neurological disorder, no psychosis. Just sleep. The doctors were baffled. How could a man perform deliberate actions like driving, unlocking doors, and attacking someone, all while unconscious? By evening, they prepared their report for the investigators. What they concluded would soon make legal history. Ken Parks hadn't planned the murder. According to science, he may have never even been awake. Almost a year after that night, Kenneth Parks stood in a packed Toronto courtroom. He looked nothing like the blood-stained man who'd walked into the police station. Dressed in a gray suit, eyes lowered, he listened as the clerk read the charges: first-degree murder and attempted murder. The prosecution painted a simple story. A man burdened by debt and shame had snapped. They told the jury he drove to his in-laws' home to silence the people he disappointed. This was rage, they said, not sleep. But the defense offered something no one expected: sleepwalking. Over several tense weeks, neurologists, psychologists, and sleep experts took the stand. They showed brain scans, medical records, and detailed accounts of Ken's lifelong sleepwalking episodes. His EEG readings revealed abnormalities in his sleep cycles. Deep-wave arousals where motor controls switched on but awareness shut off. Witnesses described him as a loving husband and father, with no history of violence. His injuries, deep cuts to his hands, matched the forensic evidence of someone grasping a knife by accident, not out of aggression. The courtroom fell silent when Dr. Broughton testified. Mr. Parks' actions were automatic. His mind was asleep, even as his body moved. Reporters called it the sleepwalking defense. Skeptics called it madness. But by the time both sides rested, one chilling question lingered over the jury. If a man kills in his sleep, is it murder at all? The courtroom was silent as the jury filed back in after 9 hours of deliberation. Ken Parks sat beside his lawyer, his hands clasped tightly, eyes fixed on the floor. Across the room, Barbara Wood's family waited, hearts torn between grief and disbelief. The foreman stood. The air felt heavy. On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the accused, not guilty. On the charge of attempted murder, not guilty. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Ken's head dropped into his hands. A soft sob escaped from his wife, Karen, sitting in the front row. On the other side, Barbara's relatives stared in shock. The man who had killed her would walk free. The judge's explanation was unprecedented. The court accepted the defense of non-insane automatism, meaning Ken's actions were involuntary, performed in a state of unconsciousness. In the eyes of the law, he had no criminal intent, and therefore no crime. Outside, reporters swarmed the courthouse steps. Headlines called it the Sleepwalking Killer case. Public opinion was divided. Some saw it as justice served by science. Others called it a terrifying loophole in the law. Ken was released immediately, after more than a year under strict supervision. He returned home to rebuild his life, but his name, and the nightmare of that night, would forever remain tied to one haunting phrase: the man who killed in his sleep. In the months after the verdict, Ken Parks tried to return to normal life. He underwent treatment for his sleep disorder and therapy to cope with the trauma of what he'd done and what he couldn't remember doing. For years, doctors studied his case, calling it a window into the darkest corners of the human mind. The ruling became a landmark in Canadian law, taught in universities and legal schools across the world. It forced courts to confront a terrifying question: can someone be guilty if they were never truly awake? Ken never reoffended. He lived quietly, away from cameras and reporters, his name forever linked to one of the strangest cases in criminal history. The Woods family, meanwhile, were left with a silence no science could explain, a wound deeper than any verdict could heal. Experts still debate the case today. Some see it as proof that the brain can betray its owner. Others fear it opened a door for dangerous excuses. But for those who remember that night in 1987, it remains something else entirely, a real story that feels like a nightmare. Plus, we all close our eyes every night, the narrator whispers. But somewhere in the world, someone might wake up with blood on their hands.